This is a story, the summary of the book is that a woman grows up eating dinner under her father's war trophy portrait of Eva Braun, who in the last 36 hours of her life was Mrs. Hitler. Eva Braun lived with Hitler for 16 years. She spent 16 years with him. And the woman in the story, whose name is Anna, has no idea why this portrait is hanging on the wall and the family is eating dinner under this strange picture of Hitler's wife. But after both of her parents have died and after her mother has died, she learns that her mother had, it appeared, a secret friendship with Eva Braun. And the portrait has the keys to following that pathway back. And in the course of the story, a lot of what she thinks is right and wrong is going to be challenged by the things she discovers, but she's going to follow the pathway of this friendship that her mother had with Eva Braun to learn more about herself, as well as her mother, as well as Germany, as well as Eva Braun. So that's kind of the framework of the story and how the plot unfolds. And in the course of what she discovers, she will naturally go back to Germany and follow the trail of Eva Braun as well. That'll be part of how she comes to certain understandings about her own life. She does this 50 years after the war. So 1995 is the start of the contemporary part of this story, which was the turning point at which people were beginning to be able to feel like they could talk about the war, including Germany's experience. Because prior to that, it was so difficult, particularly for the survivors and victims of the Holocaust, that it was just impossible to get into any depth about Germany's experience of the war. But now it was a little bit more timely by 50 years or so after the war had ended. I am really very personally connected with Germany because I lived there as a kid. I lived there from the age of 4 to 7, and it made a very, very deep impression, in part because German people were so kind to me. It was a pretty horrible time for them because it was still 15 years post-war, and many Germans still had a very hard life, but they were generous and open and welcoming for me and for my family. And I've continued to have lots of German friends. So because I wanted to understand more about Germany's history and experience in the war, I began to do a lot of reading about World War II, but the path that really led there was reading this biography about Eva Braun and realizing that things aren't always the way they appear. And I didn't necessarily, what I thought was true might not be true, and there was a lot more to learn. And the best way to get close to Hitler's world and the world of the Third Reich was through the life of Eva Braun. So that's really why that was the pathway.
All right, well, thank you guys all for coming to celebrate Phyllis's new book, The Munich Girl. We're so pleased to have Phyllis back for her 4th book, but your third event, right? Third event here with us over the years. The Munich Girl is a story of women in Germany during World War II. It's a story of secrets and hidden family history, and it's a story of the power of female friendship. I know writing this novel was a real labor of love for Phyllis, so I'm delighted to be welcoming her here tonight to share the story.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Water Street. And thank you all of you. This is very kind for me that you're here. I really appreciate it. This maybe do they want to come shop?
There's a sign.
Oh, okay. They can't shop then?
No, they can.
Oh, okay. I should hope so.
They should read the sign.
This story is so woven in with Europe for me that right now it's really tricky to think about it and talk about it. And honestly, I just want to be honest with you in case I wind up being, hey Marina, welcome, being more emotional than I would want to be. Because particularly yesterday, I was thinking about the fact that the book was published in November, and it published while John and I were in Germany in my hometown, which I did not expect to happen. That was not a plan. And it published right at the time that the attacks happened in Paris. And people sort of rushed to tell me and send me messages and say, oh, I hope you don't feel too badly about this, and of course I feel badly about it. I felt awful. But I also appreciated feeling closer, being in Europe and feeling closer to Europe at that time. hard as it also was. And I've been going through the same sort of experience this week. And someone took it upon themselves to also inform me that the Kindle version of this book, published on the same day that German academics elected to re-release Mein Kampf with all of its many annotations, I thought, wasn't that interesting? How curious, who could know? And at around the same time, I heard from a woman in Amsterdam, whom hopefully I'm going to meet in a couple of weeks when John and I go there, who has been working on translating a novel for a client of hers who is Dutch. And the novel, she couldn't tell me for the longest time, she had to keep it confidential, is about someone called Heinrich Hoffmann, who was Eva Braun's photographer boss. So he and I just keep thinking there's all this sort of synergy of things coming together all at the same time. It's exciting, it's confusing, and what I hope I can do tonight in a small way and not tie up your attention too long is to deliver some snapshots of the feel of the experience of this book. I've been writing since I was in my late 20s. I've written a lot of magazine and newspaper articles and fiction, and as Steph mentioned, this is the 4th published book. It's the 2nd work of fiction. But I have never had an experience like the one that I had in the process of this book's coming together. And to backtrack a teeny bit, you know, for years in my youthful arrogance, I would look at the absolute consuming culture in my immediate family of the Second World War. My parents met in Britain during the war. I'm here because they met in Britain during the war. My dad was an Irish kid from Boston. My mother's a Brit. And I came along later in their marriage. All of my peers they had arrived early in their parents' lives, the way my husband John did as the first child in his parents' marriage, his young 20-something parents. But I came along as sort of the last gasp of possibility to have a child in my parents' marriage. So it felt almost as though I was joining this train that was already, you know, I was stepping onto the last car, and this train was in full motion, completely embedded in a kind of history of the Second World War because it was so much a part of my parents' life. My mother was pretty significantly wounded during the war and recovered from that. She was disfigured by that injury and had some pretty traumatic experiences, as did millions of people during the war. So it was always there in kind of the psyche of my family. And I did exactly what people do when something is a part of your family culture. You know, I just completely tried to distance and separate myself from it until my parents died. And that, of course, is when everything changes, particularly when the second parent dies and you no longer have living parents in the world with you. And from the time that my father died on June 2nd, he was the second parent to die, of 2007, it's like that train just picked up speed like nothing I could imagine, and I had to hang on. Because a sequence of events happened in which John and I went to Germany almost immediately after my father died, probably no more than 2 weeks later. And it was the first time I spent an extended period of time there. We traveled together for almost 3 weeks, and then I stayed on in Germany, stayed with a friend, spent some time there with her. And during the course of being with her family, German friend, I would listen to them begin to talk about their experience during the war, and then kind of pull back. And I'm sure part of that is because I'm American, and much as they know me and care about me, I think they didn't know where the edges were of safety. And that was the summer, it was an anniversary of the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1945, you know, and then very shortly afterwards the movie that featured Tom Cruise came out. It was being made in Germany at that time. There were a lot of specials on German television about this part of history. John and I, for the first time in my life, went to Berchtesgaden, and now I wish I'd paid a lot more attention on that trip, but I wasn't ready, presumably. So after having this sort of wave of experience and realizing that Germany was important to me because it was a part of my childhood experience, as it is of John's. We were both there as military kids, so I joined this family steeped in a kind of World War II storytelling atmosphere, who then had spent 2 tours of duty in Germany, and my older sister, 10 years older, and my parents had been there almost immediately post-war. They'd been in France. My sister was born in England, after VE Day, but before the end of the war, and then started school in France, and and then they lived in the rubble. They lived in the rubble-strewn Germany of 1950, 1951 still. So she had that experience. I went with my family later in 1960. But that was still very, very close to the end of the war. And that period of my life is one of the most vibrant, one of the most important. It's incredibly foundational for me. So when John and I were able to go back to Germany together, which we have done repeatedly every chance we get, more and more I realized I wanted to really understand this culture I had such a love for. Please come in. Hi. Good to see you. And then, also, I realized I needed to understand the experience of Germany during the war. I wanted to understand the experience of everyday Germans. I knew I didn't have that story. I knew that story probably hadn't been told in any real depth. So I sat in my friend's living room, and I said out loud, like an intention to the universe, I really want to understand Germany. I want to understand the experience during the war. I know this means I'm going to have to pay more attention to understanding actual German, at least be able to come to understand it, but I really am making this commitment. I want to do this. So I came home to the United States, and within less than a week, I was given a copy of a biography of Eva Braun, written by a British writer, British and German. Her mother was German, her father was British, named Angela Lambert. And Angela Lambert was an incredibly accomplished writer, both as a journalist in Britain and wrote, oh gosh, I think it's 10 really major novels, really important novels about British history, including The Last Summer of the British Aristocracy Before Everything Changed with the 2 World Wars, The Last Year Before the War, 1939. She'd written a lot of really good historical fiction. And I was stunned at the gift of this book, but I thought to myself, well, you know, I said I wanted to know more about Germany and its experience during the war. And I realized that if I want to know that, I need to know more about the Third Reich. No matter how I feel about that, I need to come to understand more of that history, and I need to understand more about Hitler. Well, this seems like a pretty good entree. And Angela Lambert is a very engaging writer, but this was probably one of the most unusual things she ever wrote. In part because she would pattern a process of trying to understand more about Eva Braun by looking at her mother's life, because her mother was born a month later, a month after Eva Braun, in the same part of Germany, the same economic and class and kind of background as Eva Braun's family. So she felt she could extrapolate a lot by looking at her mother's life and her mother was the middle of 3 daughters, the same way Eva Braun was, in this Bavarian Catholic family where the father was a school teacher. So some people feel she took a lot of liberties with the things she did in this book, but I found the process of what she did much more revealing about Eva Braun as a person, even though I had no interest in her whatsoever. And if anyone had ever told me, I would spend 7.5 years in the process of bringing forward a work in which she's a pretty major fixture. She's not the protagonist, it's not about her really, but she's a major character and a motif in the book, I would have told you you were absolutely crazy. I could have found 6 other people who would be far better candidates. But the thing that happened for me in reading Angela Lambert's book is I saw how much about Eva Braun that had been shared was completely inaccurate. It is as if somebody had taken the details of Steph's life, and because we're both females, and we both live in Exeter, and presumably we both really love books, had just proceeded to transfer those details onto my life. There were photographs attributed as Eva Braun, which were not her, in places and circumstances. It's a long, long list of inaccuracies, and that kind of affected me. I thought, you know, this is just wrong. And it's not as if the information wasn't available. But the more penetrating experience that reading that book had for me is that I realized I knew next to nothing about Eva Braun, but everything I did know was a preconception, and I had allowed it to exist. I had allowed my own thinking to carry these ideas as if they were true. And I feel very, very strongly in life about the importance of not harboring prejudice. A sort of phrase I say to myself is, if we harbor prejudice, it will be the cause of deprivation and ignorance, meaning very likely what we deprive ourselves of in terms of truth. And when I think of ignorance, I think of what's being ignored that's important, not just a state of seemingly not knowing, but what's being ignored that ought to be paid attention to. So it was a sort of reckoning for me to realize I had allowed this kind of behavior in myself without even being particularly conscious of it. So there was a sort of point of decision for me that I was going to learn more about her life and wherever else that led in the framework of German history from the war. And that in order to do that, I was going to have to assume that I knew nothing. And I was going to have to really, really investigate, hold things up against each other, see how they informed each other. And one of the things I began to do, I did a great deal of reading, but I began to watch Eva Braun's films. I began to watch, there's a sequence of 3 DVDs you can obtain. All of her photographs and films are in the public domain and have been for a long time. And as I would watch her and I would read entries from her diary, there was this real incongruous feeling between what she seemed to almost portray as a role in relation to being with Hitler and then the rest of her life, which was a totally different experience. She was light. She was delightful, people said. They enjoyed her. It's as though there was a sort of compartmentalization of the role that she played with Hitler. So as I continued to do more reading, one of the things that had happened for me when I read this biography about her is that when I finished reading it, I was incredibly disappointed. There was something inside me that felt like it wanted to keep going. And it wasn't as though I were going to write a biography about Eva Braun. There was no need to do this. That's not what I felt drawn to do. But I wanted to continue on with the investigation. So I wrote down in my daily date book the day I finished reading the book. I've never done anything like this in my whole life. But I think because it was sort of a watershed day and I sort of couldn't get out of the book, I wrote it down. And in the course of the next year, when I did a great deal of research, I finally reached a point where I really wanted to find a primary source. I wanted to find somebody who had met her, because I was getting so many different kinds of impressions from so much different kinds of reading, as well as watching these films of her and looking at hundreds and hundreds of photographs. This is long before I went to the National Archives and looked at her actual photograph albums. I wanted to talk to someone who had actually met her because I was getting these emotional impressions, and I thought I just may be so far off base, I'd really like to corroborate what I feel like I'm discovering. And I decided that I would try to get in touch with Eva Braun's only known living relative, who was a cousin, who was 8 years younger than she was. And her cousin had by this point done lots of interviews because after 50 years of imposed silence that her husband insisted be the case, that their kids not know that she'd been related to Eva Braun, that nobody know. The husband had died, and she'd finally sort of opened up and started to do interviews. And I found out she lived very, very close to a town where a good friend of ours lives, and the friend of ours is closer in age to the cousin, and I thought, maybe she can help me. Maybe she can help me make this connection. But I could not figure out how to get in touch with her. I tried a number of different ways and got nowhere. And finally I decided, I can be brave. I can try to get in touch with Angela Lambert. What the heck? Her agent's name is in the book. I know who her publisher is. At a minimum, I can send a letter. It may not get anywhere, but I can at least make this effort. So I decided, opened up the browser, began the search, called up her name, and up came her obituary. Mm-hmm. Because the book she wrote about Eva Braun is the last thing that she ever did. And I get the sense she didn't have nearly as much time as she wanted to have. She was really sick. I think it was a second bout of cancer. And she finished the book, which is quite commendable. It's an amazing thing to me. If you want to guess the day that she died, it's the date in my date book. The date I finished reading the book that I felt so compelled to write down in this date book. So that for me, as have many things have been, is what I think of as psycho-spiritual breadcrumbs. Because there's been a really, really long trail of them in this process. And there's a statement attributed to Einstein, and I don't really know whether he said it. I keep trying to prove that he said it, but I suppose it doesn't matter, because what it conveys matters to me either way. Allegedly, he said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And for me in life, what's really, really important is how to make a good partnership between that rational mind, which we need and we need to use thoughtfully, and that other kind of knowing that is so much larger, that I believe are meant to be a pair that dances together. I think that's the purpose of this life, is to figure out how to work that balance. And for me, the process of this book represented being willing to, I don't even know what the term is to use, surrender might apply, pull back, maybe pull back the leash on that mind that wants to take over and know and encompass, when in fact that's not the way I'm going to find out things I don't know. And as the course of this story unfolded, the themes are, you know, this is not really a book about Ava Brown. As Steph said, this is a book about the power of friendships, particularly women's friendships. You know, particularly friendships that allow individuals to see each other whole and honor each other that way and accompany each other, regardless of what the other extenuating circumstances of life might be. Because I think there's a real power in this that's a really important part of our going forward, you know, in the course of the human story. So after I was unable to speak with a primary source, my husband and I went to a little place called the Torkenhof Guest House, which is right next door to where Hitler's house was outside of Berchtesgaden. We went there, we booked, I think, 5 nights there. And it was middle of July, and the weather, as the owner of our hostess told us, was about like the second week of December. It was cold, it was almost sleeting at times, it was so cold, there was this fog surrounding the mountain. And we were sort of encased in this guest house, and by this point I was feeling kind of demoralized in the process of pursuing this. I, in some ways, had advanced and begun to actually write down some things, some scenes had come together, but I was feeling very baffled and very confused about where things might go. And the owner of this guest house is called Frau Scharfenberg, Ingrid Scharfenberg. And she was sort of the embodiment of every stereotype I ever think of the Teutonic woman. You know, there was, I think we're all maybe of an age in this room where we might remember Young Frankenstein, the movie Young Frankenstein. Do you remember the woman, the character that Cloris Leachman played, who'd sort of appear with her high hair, and she'd change the whole tone of the room? That's what Frau Scharfenberg was like for me. She was kind of intimidating, and she was in her mid to late 70s. So she had been alive during the war. She had been alive during the time that this was Hitler's mountain. Her family had owned this guest house for generations, and they had owned the adjacent piece of land where the house that originally was a little chalet that Hitler rented and eventually became Berghof, his huge, you know, huge mountain retreat. She lived right next door to this as a child, and her mother had run this guest house until the Nazis had confiscated their property and established a barracks there for the guards that guarded Hitler, the Leibstandart. So she, you know, I wasn't sure how she was going to feel about even bringing up something like Ava Brown, because it was really obvious to me that she hated the Nazis. No doubt about that. And her family had managed to get their property back after the war, which was a very, very difficult thing to do. So here I am with Frau Scharfenberg kind of wondering, you know, if I can bring this up, and I'm kind of nervous, feeling sort of like, you know, I would around a principal as a child in school. But she's a very kind, very wise, very thoughtful person. And one day I came down the stairs, and she had this office that was always locked up tight. And if she went in there, the door only opened a little ways and it was closed right behind her. But this day the door was yawning wide open, and there at the far end of the room was her desk, and there over her desk, this big, was a portrait of Ava Brown and her 2 Scottish Terriers. And I stopped and looked at this thing in disbelief, and this voice in my head said, oh, clearly, it's probably not a problem to ask, you know, at a minimum. So I did ask her, and she said to me, come down before breakfast tomorrow morning. I'll have time, I'll have 40 minutes. You know, she's making the eggs, she's making the muesli, she's doing whatever, getting breakfast ready. And she would answer my questions, and she would talk with me. I didn't ask her a whole lot of questions. I listened to her stories. And the 2 stories that made the biggest impact were, her mother had once gone to Munich from Berchtesgaden, about a 4-hour trip at least in those days, on the train, and had wound up meeting Ava Brown on the train. Now remember, they lived next door to each other when Ava Brown was at Hitler's house. in Berchtesgaden, but they hadn't really had much of a chance to interact. So they had this long train trip together. And this is in the book. This is in this, this is a part of the story in the book. When the mother came home, she gathered her whole family around the kitchen table, kind of like the matriarch, and she made a point of explaining to them how important it was to be really courteous and kind to Fräulein Braun. When you see her, greet her happily, ask after her, ask her if you can help her. And part of the reason for this, I suspect, is that most of the Nazi wives who lived on the mountain at that time treated Eva Braun with immense contempt. Her status as the unmarried companion was about as low as you could get. It was what would be called a backstreet existence. Today, we can't even imagine. But in those days, it was a really big deal that she had allowed herself to take this role, and she was treated very shabbily. But what the mother said is, she has excellent manners, she's so courteous and kind, she's a real person of substance. Make sure that you treat her well. And the fact that the mother went to this effort to tell her family this was significant. But then, this stiff Frau Schaffner, so stern, kind of softened. And she looked like a girl. She looked really, really young, as she proceeded to tell me that when she would have times that she would see Eva Braun on the mountain as a young girl, she would feel so special. Eva would treat her so well and speak to her thoughtfully and ask after her, and she said she would feel really special. Those times were very, very important in her memory. And just watching her, all this time later, I realized, she's born in 33. I'm watching a 70-year-old memory transform someone. This speaks of that emotional quality that I'm picking up. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that Eva's cousin talked about, what it was like to be that younger cousin and how special Eva had made her feel, particularly as a female. Because being in Germany at that time, as things were taking hold, it was hard to be a female in that time frame anyway, but things were getting worse in terms of how women and females and girls were perceived. So that was a turning point for me. And a second turning point in the course of the research was when I discovered, totally randomly one day, looking at stuff on the computer, that this former, very, very high up SS officer had chosen at the trials in Nuremberg, the trials in 1948, which are called the ministry trials, the trials that came later, to speak, as he phrased it, on behalf, I must now speak on behalf of the much maligned Eva Braun. And what he proceeded to say, that's in the court documents, it's all recorded now, is that at the end of the war, toward the end of the war, in Hitler's bunker in Berlin, when things were going crazy, and shortly before Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide, Hitler was really off the edge, and he made a decision, which became a written order, that these Allied prisoners of war, who numbered in the magnitude of 35,000, that's the number you hear given. It's undoubtedly not an exact number, but close enough. At this point, people like Himmler and others wanted to be sure those prisoners would be available for negotiation with the Allies. But what Hitler said, first of all, it was going to be a forced march, and there were forced marches of POWs as well as others. But what Hitler had said in this order is they're all to be shot. And if you've ever seen the movie made in Germany, Der Untergang, about this end period, those scenes that would be parodied about Hitler completely losing it, that we've often now taken down from YouTube, but for a while we're up there. That's the tone of the time when he, was screaming out, shoot them all, shoot them all, shoot them all. And Eva Braun apparently elected, and she never intervened in this way, in almost any way ever, with anything that Hitler did. But she somehow was instrumental in those orders being given to this man, whose name is Gottlob, which means God praise, Berger, who gave the testimony at Nuremberg, because she knew he would not carry them out. She knew he would not carry those orders out and have those prisoners of war shot. Now, my theory about this is that she probably did this to protect Hitler's reputation. A breach of, she would have had no knowledge at that time of the death camps, none. She would have had knowledge of concentration camps, but that was a different matter. She probably believed she was acting in Hitler's best interest, but I also think there was a moral courage aspect of it for her as well. And because of that, an awful lot of lives were saved. Of course, an awful lot of lives weren't saved. in the travesty of this war, but that's the magnitude of Portsmouth. You know, that's a pretty significant number of people, and that's brothers and fathers and sons and friends, you know, loved ones of many, many more people. And I subsequently found out that among those people are two uncles of my mother's, one of whom was a prisoner of war in both wars. And because of that act, very likely that's why they survived that war, where they might not have survived that war. So that was another major, major turning point for me. And I don't want to keep you much longer because I think this is more history than I may have planned to share. But in the course of discovering more about what would become the story of the book, which literally was a process of discovery as it unfolded, many trips back and forth in Germany, as well as writing that I did here in the right here in Exeter at St. Anthony's. One of the things that had occurred in Angela Lambert's book is that there was a pencil, a little propelling pencil that she kept writing about of her mother's, that she had thought really hard about buying from a military artifacts dealer, and at the last minute she'd changed her mind. In the course of my research, I was connected with many, many people, one of whom, hi, good to see you, one of whom was a military artifacts dealer. He's in his late 80s now, and one of the things he does is he buys up these sort of things that GIs brought back at the end of the war as war trophies to help their widows. Their widows aren't the least bit interested in this china from Hitler's house or wherever, and he sort of helps them by brokering these sales. And I was buying photographs from him and finally found out that he had been in Eva Braun's house after the war. He had been there at the, you know, in 1945. And he had things of hers to sell, but he had so much stuff he didn't know where to find it. So when I asked him what sorts of things he might have and to let me know, the only thing he was able to find was the pencil. And it was the pencil that Angela Lambert had referred to. And when he found out I was interested, he'd had a price listed at his website. And he said, well, tell me more about this book. You know, and I talked with him about what was happening. And he said, you know, it's really important to me that these things find a place where somebody's going to understand what they are. And then maybe one day they'll get back to Germany, for all we know. So he gave me this pencil at a price that I could afford. And I proceeded to buy a number of other things from him over time. And in the course of this process, I also came to own the portrait of Eva Braun that's a part of the book. I'm not going to say any more than that at this point, but that's a part of the story, both of the book and my experience. But there was a day I was feeling really, really down, because I would, you know, sort of vacillate between surrendering to the process of trying to have this partnership between my rational mind and where the intuitive mind wanted to lead. It was always just down a dark tunnel that I didn't know where things were going to end. And I would lose confidence and I would have doubt. And one day I was in a little hotel up in northern New Hampshire with my brother-in-law and his two kids. And I had spent the whole day kind of cataloging Eva Braun's life, all 33 years of it, in a scrapbook. And the only things I'd been able to write up to that time were all scenes that involved Eva Braun. Those all got written first, curiously. And the only thing holding them together was a handkerchief. And it all seemed pretty flimsy, and I didn't understand how the story was going to hold together. And I felt really discouraged. And I went downstairs, and the only place to check email in those days was the lobby computer. And I decided I'd distract myself. And I got an email from this military artifacts dealer in Georgia who was on his way to Thanksgiving in some mountain place in Arkansas, and said, I want you to know I put a package in the mail to you because you've been, you know, such a good customer, and I really appreciate it. And he said, it's just a little thing I've had for years. It's something I acquired, you know, he said, back in the days when I was in Munich. I knew that meant when he was in Eva Braun's house. He said, I've attached a photograph so you can see it. And, you know, I hope it's okay that I sent it. It's just a thank you gift for all the kindness. And of course, what it really is a luncheon napkin. But it's close enough to a handkerchief that it served the purpose for me at that time to tie things together, because it is hand embroidered. It's a part of the story also. And it's one of the many kinds of sort of guiding and shifting and validation that would come as the story unfolded. There's a raft of things now that I own that have come to me that were a part of Eva Braun's life, that really the best way I can describe it is they came to me in ways like this that I could never have predicted or expected. And despite the fact that this book isn't really about Eva Braun, I have to acknowledge that without her, I wouldn't have reached the point where at least there's this completed book today that I hope is going to be about themes like really we're here to come back to the reunion of our whole self. We're here in this life to come home to who it is that we really are. And we all play a part in that process. We never know who it is. Maybe someone that's even lived decades before we did and we've never met them. But that there's this interrelation in the wholeness of us going forward. And also, as Steph pointed out, to really reflect on the power that friendships can have and genuine unconditional love can have that can echo through generations in ways that we can't predict. So there are deeper themes, I hope, are in the story of this book because they're the ones that mean the most to me. But if people read it simply for the story, I'm grateful. And that's a good place to stop. It's probably at least 15 minutes beyond where it should have been. And I do invite, if any of you have read the book, please to feel free without spoilers. I found with people who are reviewing it that they sort of have to oops and backtrack because the story kind of winds down in on itself, and it can be very easy to give things away without meaning to. But I'd love to hear from you. But before I do that, I would like to introduce Marina Kirsch, who is sitting across from me.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Marina!
Whose journey with World War II history in her own family is very profound, and I encourage you to investigate her book, Flight of Remembrance. And because I connected with her book so deeply, I then connected with her. And Marina has been a real companion for me in this process because she's my book's designer, both interior and exterior, and I'm really grateful that you're able to be here tonight. So I thank you all for listening to this long-winded, not necessarily exactly where I thought I'd go, but a little bit of snapshots about this still, in some ways for me, slightly inexplicable process that now seems to have reached some stage of a new stage, I guess, because others are spending their time with it, which I'm grateful for. So thank you.
I'm not afraid to jump in.
Please do.
I just love this book. I just loved it. I got so involved, and for me, my stepmother had been in Germany during and after the war, and she would never talk about it. So this was kind of a bridge, a little bridge, because I think that we don't know what it was like. It's important. It's been important for me to share this. And I really deeply want to commend you for staying with it for so long, and I imagine that there was a large intuitive process, and to trust yourself on such a, must have felt like you were going on fumes sometimes, and to trust yourself in that journey is a great example, I think, to everybody, that to trust the spirit and not logic, intellect, etc. There was something guiding you always, and then you'd be given these material assurances. Is it a spoiler to ask about? Is it a spoiler to ask about the portrait of Ava that Hitler did?
Yes, you can ask about it.
Oh, okay.
It's not, I don't think it's a spoiler.
Okay. I just wondered if you know where that is. It's not a great portrait. He was not a great portrait artist.
Correct.
But she cherished it.
Presumably. I can tell you what I believe I know about it. It was purchased on eBay.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And the only reason that that happened is because it was 2008. eBay was begging you to come shopping. You know, I mean, it was a bad time financially. People weren't shopping. It was summer. I was in Germany when that came into my possession. And the reason that I bought it is because the art dealer who put it out, who was in Hawaii, he originally had been in California. He had no provenance, he had no statement of what provenance, but he had a lot of great information, and he gave great up-close shots of important things like the artist's signature, details, the framer's label on the back, which was a Munich framer, and the date, well, the date was August 22nd, 1936, and by that point I had done enough reading. I knew 36 was a hugely significant year in Eva Braun's life, especially in relation to Hitler. I also knew that, you know, almost nobody knew about that significance of her in his life, so it's not like somebody would have been faking a portrait of her. The portrait, this is much nicer because this is a colorized photograph. This is probably the first photograph she gave Hitler at around the age of 17, probably at Christmas time, I'm going to guess, because she met him in October. To ingratiate herself, I'm guessing. And the portrait is this view. But it's what's called Conti crayon, I think, which is like reddish brown charcoal. It's under glass, it's framed. As I said, the framer's label is on the back. And when I looked at enough of the details and I saw the A and I saw the two, vertical bars, and then the date covers the crossbar, I knew, my crown tingled when I was in Germany. And the other thing that really struck me is the portrait looks more, in some ways, like Hitler's niece, Gaily Raubel, who was probably the obsessive love of his life. She committed suicide. She had lived with him in Munich for a time period, sort of as his ward. And that's a whole story. There are all kinds of wonderful, couple of really good novels written about that, as well as nonfiction. And the portrait also through here looked like his mother. And he was pretty, the relationship with his mother is a unique thing in itself. His background is I've learned more about Hitler than I ever wanted to know. I've spent more time in his living room than I ever wanted to. But I haven't yet had the portrait authenticated. I've tried to find the means to do that, and I'm open to recommendations of anybody who might know where the best place to do that is. I don't care so much whether it turns out to be authentic or not, because the portrait has served its purpose for me in the process of the story. But the portrait's at my house. That's where the portrait is. Yes, and I don't know how much.
Hitler studied as an artist, right? Hitler studied as an artist.
Absolutely, that was what he wanted, and he considered himself a Künstler, as they'd say in German. He considered himself an artist. Artists were at the top of his hierarchy, essentially. And had he somehow been allowed to just pursue art, it would have been a very different story, although I think, well, it doesn't matter. It would have been a very different story. So I hope that, I don't know if that addresses and answers the question.
So you have it.
Yeah. Since, well, the greatest irony of all, it was rather shocking, the day that that sale closed on eBay, I had forgotten all about it. The bid was like a 5-day bid. I had a really, really terrible thing happen to me in Germany in terms of a relationship, really, really hard, really difficult with someone, and I came home in pieces, and I had won this portrait. And the date, of course, that I won the portrait was August 22nd, and the date on the portrait is August 22nd. And I remember when I noticed it that night, I wrote for hours. I still have that journal of pages and pages of kind of reflecting on this and wondering where this was going to lead. So, yeah. Anyway, too much answer.
No.
Well, you've been incredibly articulate, and I don't think you glanced down at your notes once, so I'm very impressed. Thank you for sharing all this.
Oh, thank you.
Did you ever get a chance to interview Ava's cousin?
I didn't. Still still alive. I'd still like to. I'd like to give her a copy of the book if she'd like. I'd like to, if life would allow for that. I know the town she lives in, so it would be easier to find her than I've let myself believe, I think. Maybe it just wasn't timely to find her then, possibly. Maybe.
Before reading the book, I guess I had the same kind of preconceived impression of Eva Braun that you mentioned from what, tabloids or whatever, and you make her a much more. One feels sympathy for her when you read the book, and I'm wondering. Did that come from Lambert as well? Did she see Eva Braun as a much more deserving of sympathy than...
Definitely, definitely. And there's a newer biography by a German woman named Heike, I think it's Gudemacher, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, which is very, very good, and it's now translated in English. It's more factual. She's very careful in her research, and I respect. And she calls a lot of things into question that have been sort of given as factual about Eva Braun. She questions certain things, but she still attributes a lot of strength to Eva Braun, a lot of intellectual strength. Eva Braun would constantly try to learn and recreate herself to please Hitler in the things that she knew were important to him, like culture, history. Just knowledge in general. She was always sort of trying to be a good enough consort for him, I expect, probably. But I'm really happy to hear that that's the feeling that you got. I worry that I hope there haven't been any liberties taken. A lot of the things that Eva Braun says in the book, Eva Braun said. And it was fun to use some of those things. And a lot of the things that happened anecdotally were true. You know, I'm working right now with a young guy I've known since he was 9 months old. That's when I met him. And he's a graphic designer. No competition here, Marina, but he's making a trailer. He's trying to make a trailer for the book, which I hadn't even considered. And now I've completely forgotten what it was I was going to say, so I'll back up. Sorry. Whatever that was about. Oh. You know, Hitler would insist that Germany was his bride. You know, there could be no bride, because of course then any woman could imagine herself the potential lucky person, you know, that's going to maybe win him. And then Goebbels would go on and on about how the Führer has no private life, and you'd say Eva Braun, you know, writing these letters like, Ich bin Fräulein kein Privatleben, you know, I miss no private life. You know, she had to keep this secret life. But the fact was, and this is the thing that meant the most to me at the end of the book, there were two kind of realizations for me. One was that, and I still don't know what to do with this, I feel like this is a topic for discussion in groups about equality in general, and men and women, and masculinity and femininity and balance. All of the things that the Third Reich sought to suppress, repress, deny, demean, the feminine aspects of care and compassion, is what he came home to her for. Think about that paradox. Think about that, extrapolate that, you know, in a larger way to life today. Because I think that still pervades, whether you are a man or a woman. Either way, I think there's great difficulty of being able to own all that it is to be a human being safely, you know, in a way that's supported. And I really believe that will change. I think we're in the process of that change now. I think there are very good signs that show that we are, but it's painful and it's hideous right now. It's really quite awful. So.
You don't believe in the Trump America ascendancy.
I can say nothing. I will say nothing.
Good girl.
I would not fight my
No. We really. I mean, it's you know it's interesting to watch things unfold. Having done the reading I did in the period that I did so intensively, of you know the era of National Socialism, and then you know look around today and watch what's happening in the world, and especially of course right now in Europe. Things are really intensifying. When we were in Europe in November, we had multiple experiences, John and I, and then I continued to have with asylum seekers. And they were profound experiences, including going to a camp with a friend of mine who was volunteering there. And it's very humbling. And the thing that was striking to me is to realize how many of the people that were in Germany then had gotten there very much the way the Jews had left Germany, the ones who got out early because they had the understanding and they had the means to do that. It's a very, very similar situation to a lot of the Syrian families I met. And despite the fact they had more affluence in Syria, overnight they became the dispossessed. People won't make eye contact. They know exactly what it means to be the poor, of the poor. And it was very, very moving to me to have you know encounters with them and have this experience. Any other thoughts or questions from, yes, I see Marina and then I saw Pamela.
I just want to mention that for me, your book really triumphed in two ways. First of all, you managed to not only give Eva Braun a personality that you researched, and therefore you were very true to it, but you also managed to give a pathetic sense of humanity to Hitler. And what you just described is how you did that. And I really think that to me is a great accomplishment, because I wasn't sure that that could ever be done. The other thing that for me was of great interest, because my family had a story from the other side, having been in Germany during World War II. My father escaping Latvia in 1939, ending up in Germany.
The
And
only
both
safe
he
place
and
to
my
go.
grandfather both were forced to serve in the German military. They did talk about their experience, not my grandfather, but my mother and my father both did. And the information that came out was very interesting, but your book takes it a step further. My family immigrated to the U.S. in 1951, but you talk about what happened even beyond that point, filling in a lot of blanks for me about what might have occurred, what might they have experienced had they stayed in Germany. So I really want to thank you for that, and how much you researched it and how much heart and soul you put into it. And finally, I just want to mention what a great privilege and an honor it was to collaborate with you on your book design.
And fun.
And fun. I mean, we had great fun, and it was really a spiritual collaboration as well as a creative
I
one.
thank you. I'm very grateful. And you were like the kind of, it's going to sound gross.
The midwife.
How can I say? Yeah. Well, no, you were, but you were
Yeah.
like the part where the body really gets going, pushing the baby out. You know, the
I tell her,
contractions to the
Phyllis,
transition
breathe,
and delivery.
breathe.
Exactly. It
Don't
was
rush it.
shocking how quickly it all sped up. Once you just put a cover in front of me, and it just went from
There's
there.
nothing worse
The
than a
cover's
book
beautiful.
born prematurely.
Thank you, and thank you, Barbara. I
I
hope she
love
heard
it.
you.
I'm-
Thank you.
The
This
cover,
is
I'm
an
in-
author.
I'm in love with the cover. Covers mean everything to me, and as an
Exactly.
author,
I
I
love
hold
working on that
my
cover.
breath until I get my cover.
It's exceptional.
And when I saw that, I was like, I have to know more.
Just the first step was getting that portrait of Ava Brown colorized, getting her to look right, not made up, getting that sense
like
of
It's such a
sort
great
of
blend.
fresh.
It's such a great,
young
I mean,
beauty.
this is real, but it's the foreground and the background. It's really, I love it.
And I just, while we're on the topic, if I may, and this is okay for time?
Oh, of course.
Okay. This is not Munich, as some people have pointed out immediately. And we tried images of Munich, and it just looked like, it looked like a Rick Steves book. I mean, it just didn't. It looked like a tour guide. It just didn't work. And Pamela, I have not forgotten you. So this is my hometown of Wertheim, mine, in the very pointing finger of Baden-Württemberg. The state, it's like a little peninsula that sticks up into Bavaria at the top, at the Main River. And this is a sort of atmospheric photograph that some kind of fixed camera on a building took. It was online. And this is a Sparkasse bank flag, which is red and white, this banner. So Marina's, handiwork was, first of all, to flip the photo. It's a little more difficult to recognize.
And make it look more like a painting.
And make it look more like a painting, and also create this hint of what in German would be called the Hakenkreuz. I said I did not want the full thing there, but given the era of this book, it was an important emblematic inclusion. And I mean, the flag was right there waiting, it was sort of like the banner was just waiting to be changed to this rather unappealing figure, which, of course, in the time of the war, there would never have been one. It would have been covered. They covered everything. It just completely took over. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Well, Hitler did a lot of architectural drawing, didn't he? I mean,
Yes.
of
And
buildings,
that
and I
was
thought
his
that was
skill.
part of,
And
I thought that was part of
exactly.
Harvard.
That's
what
so
I saw
interesting, and they were
when I
always very
saw
angular.
it.
That's
Yeah.
very interesting. I never thought about that before. It is evocative of his drawings. Now, Pamela, I apologize that I started talking and you were waiting.
No, I just wanted to mention how incredible this book is. I had such difficulty putting it down every night. My poor husband wants to go to bed right now. But it was so difficult because I was so engrossed in it. And what I saw in Eva Braun was the innocence and the humbleness in her that you portrayed, that I had no connection with at all. You always have that, like you said, that preconceived notion, and that's what came out. And I said, oh my goodness, so she was so different. And yes, Hitler came home to her to get that comfort and to get that love, because he didn't have that anywhere else. He was an autonomy of himself. And so it was so fascinating that he chose her and she chose him.
I really think that's it. I think you've just said it.
Yes.
I think she chose him.
Yeah.
A friend of mine has said for years, well, the female chooses the male in every other species. Why would we imagine it's different? And it gets a little controversial as a topic. But I really do think she chose him and made a very deliberate effort to go after him. I never ever thought of this until I heard you say that. It's the first time.
You hinted at I felt that you hinted at something when you said that she gave him this, trying to win him.
Mhm.
And that was the first time I
Mhm.
heard you.
Absolutely. And I think her whole design was this idea that we have to, there's a place in a conversation in the book where she says, we sort of have to work things out. This is not the exact language. We have to kind of play with things with men. You give them one impression, but really our agenda is something else. And I'm sorry. I don't think that's the way human beings should behave toward each other. But it's certainly a dynamic of the way and it's a way women have tried to co-opt power we don't necessarily, or we
Couldn't get
hadn't
another
felt
way.
we had, particularly in their generation, for sure. So.
If you haven't read it, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
If you haven't read it, please. It's phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
There's a texture
to it. There's a texture to it that
Oh,
really enfolds you.
Isn't it?
Yes. And she was tormented also.
She was tormented also, absolutely, really
That was
important not to
very
overlook.
powerful.
Lots of pills, lots of alcohol toward the end of life, no doubt at all, to get by. Yeah, and her cousin's description of the end, her cousin spent time with her, and I won't forget you, Lee, in late '44, when Hitler left in, I think it was early July, I'm losing track now, of '44, and then of course the attempt was made on his life. He never came back, he never went back to Berchtesgaden, and she continued to wait there. And her cousin went and stayed with her there and talked about how incredibly distraught she was. You know, she was really a wreck. And so Lee, thank you for waiting.
Will you be doing any more writing using Eva Braun as a part of the story?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question. What I think I'm committed to doing now is continuing to pull together what's more of a memoir, sort of spiritual memoir is the way I think about it, about the process with this book. It's not hard because I have journals and journals and they've got sticky notes sticking on. It's really more a compiling and then a seeing where things go. I have to do it for myself whether I publish it or I don't. And in this day and age it's just as easy to publish it, what the heck. I'd love to write about probably the post-war period. I realize that I'm now very attracted to that, but I have a work that I would like to finish that's set in the 1800s in this part of New Hampshire that I would really love to finish. It's partly set on the Isles of Shoals, and it involves all of the isms that people were completely taken up with them, because people were sort of seeking for a spiritual life in all kinds, table tapping in all kinds of different ways. They were really seeking the truth. I think the spirit of the age had come in by that point, and people were feeling it, but they didn't understand why. So that book is maybe, I don't know, maybe 150, 180 pages. I'd like to go back, maybe, I think, and do that. I think that would be my next fiction effort. We'll see.
That sounds fun.
Well, thanks.
That sounds very
Appreciate the
fun.
encouragement. I'd like to spend time in that time period. Celia Thaxter's world at the Isles of Shoals and all the sphere of people. And then there's a woman who was in Eliot about 10 years later at what's now the Baha'i School there, the Baha'i Conference Center. Her name is Sarah Farmer. Very, very similar personality to Celia Thaxter. And many of the people in Celia's parlor also went and spent time with Sarah. And I'd like to sort of draw those two worlds together in this book, if that's a possibility. That's a goal, but very different from wartime Germany.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you
Phyllis.
so
This was
much,
great.
and thank you all. The story began to emerge when the portrait of Eva Braun came into my life, and when this funny little handkerchief that she's embroidered came into my life. Those were two really key elements because they're a key part of the story. They're a part of what starts to reveal and point to different kinds of clues, like breadcrumbs in the story. But I began looking at Eva Braun's life and doing my reading and research around late in 2007. And it wasn't until, I think, around 2009 that all those things began to coalesce and scenes began to come that would connect with other things. I don't write in order. I don't write at the beginning to the end. So initially, most of the scenes that got written were the ones that involved Eva Braun. And that's probably because the history I'd been researching about her was so close and so near, I would just kind of go into those scenes. But eventually, I began to write in enough places that things began to connect and they began to point me to other things. That's sort of the way the process works for me. I guess it's sort of like a puzzle. I mean, it's kind of like seeing these pieces and seeing how they fit, as opposed to deciding what the piece will be. It's seeing how the pieces seem to begin to fit together, if that makes sense. It's a hard thing to explain, because it is a real combination of intuitive process where I would be led, and then thinking about things and doing more rational kind of seeing how stuff seemed to go together. I mean, the most important thing in the book, as my husband often says, is that if Eva Braun's on a train going somewhere, or the people in the story are, in 1938, there had to be a train running that day on that line from that place. That anything that's historical has to really happen. And I was talking with a fellow here tonight who reads a lot of history and said it's so difficult when he reaches a point in a book where he knows something isn't accurate because he wants to stay with the story, but it's a very difficult thing to do because it's like it's taken that disbelief away. He's not able to suspend that disbelief. One of the things that really surprises me is that people sometimes seem to feel that this book's job is to exonerate or redeem Ethel Brown, and that has never been the goal of the book. My feeling is just present what I found, and people can make their own decisions, but that's not what I'm trying to do. Ethel Brown in the book is a really good motif for looking at the effects of oppression on all of us. She's kind of a case sample that you can take a lot of what applies to her life and pull it out and look at a lot of our lives today and the things we're still struggling with in the world. I think the responses that delight me the most are when people are able to connect with the deeper themes of the book, including the fact that there's an element in the book of the story being layered. You kind of dip in a certain distance and then it kind of, I think of it as kind of a spiral, the shape of the story, where it makes it really hard not to spoil it. I've had reviewers write really enthusiastic reviews and they've given away 3 really critical things that I want people to have to wait until halfway through or almost near the end, knowing that at the beginning would kind of spoil your reading experience. So that part's been a little tricky in people's responses. Yeah, and it's been hard to ask people not to do that, but I'm glad I've been able to. I am going to collect probably a small book-sized work about the process of what it felt like to have the experience of writing this book, which I felt very directed to write. One of the things, I try to be really careful how I talk about this, there are experiences I had that I may never be able to explain. And one of them was a night in a hotel room in Germany where the phone rang. And it was a very important phone call in which I made a very important connection. But neither one of us had initiated that phone call. Neither one of us had dialed the phone. So there are things of that nature that have happened, as well as very pragmatic. I read more than 150 books to really steep myself in that time period. There are things that are very thought-based and things that are inexplicable that happen to help make the connection. So I feel the need to reflect on that a bit and pull that together. I'm a writer, so the least I can do is take a shot, see if I can do that.